Today's subject that we're going to talk about is lone worker safety. And this is one that is an interesting subject because we haven't paid it as much attention in the United States as other parts of the world. Um, but it's a serious issue. When you're working alone, things are different. Mike gave a presentation a few months ago on I've got your six and watching each other's back. Well, if I'm alone, nobody's watching my six unless I have a system in place to protect me. And that's what we want to talk about today. But before we do that, we want to start with a poll. Mike's going to launch that here in just a second. Just a few quick questions to see what you're doing as it pertains to lone worker safety. First question, and I hope everybody will participate here. First question: do you ever work alone? Second question, is there a job you won't do alone? And third question, does your organization have a system to track lone workers? Interesting questions here. We'll give you just a few seconds here to jump in and answer those questions. And then we'll review the numbers there. Mike, do you ever work alone?
All the time.
All the time. Yeah. Is there a job you won't do alone?
Oh yeah. There are many jobs that I will not do alone.
That's right. Doing the dishes, right? That's
right. Dishes, tailgates,
a few of those things. All right. We have about 78 of participants have participated on that.
Yep.
We can probably close the poll and share the results.
And share the results.
Okay, so let's look at that. I think most of you probably figured this one out. 86% said, "Yep, I work alone." Sometimes, I'm actually quite surprised that there's 14% that say they never work alone. But I guess if you walk into an office and that's where you spend your day is around other people, there will be some of those. Mike and myself, you think of our jobs. We travel the state. And so there are days when we don't see anybody from the trust because we're traveling to some far-flung part of the corner of the state. And we spend a lot of time driving, and then we work with people, and then we travel to someplace else. And sometimes we don't roll into our hotel or back to our home base until way after dark. Is there a job you won't do alone? 64% said no, I'm not going to touch that because of the hazard of that job. And when it comes to does your organization have a system to track lone workers, 76% say we don't do anything to keep track of our people. That's kind of what my suspicion was of what we would find. But what does that mean? Well, I guess it depends on the type of work that we're doing. So let's go ahead and close that poll, and we'll move on to the next question. Working alone is more hazardous than working with somebody else. Why is that? Well, I could simply have a medical problem, have a heart attack or something that doesn't have anything to do with safety as much as I just have a medical issue. I pass out for some reason. Well, if somebody is there working with me, well, I get help right away. But if I'm alone, it may be some time before I can get some assistance. I think back several years, as you look at this picture here, this is a person named Aaron Ralston. He was down in the Moab area. It's been probably almost 2 decades ago now. And he decided to go through a slot canyon. He was a big outdoors person. And he went out into this slot canyon all by himself, and he didn't let anybody know where he was going. And there was an incident that happened there where a boulder came free and pinned his arm, smashed his arm, basically his hand and the lower part of his arm, and pinned him in place. The boulder was many hundreds of pounds, and he was trapped there upwards of 6 days before he finally decided that if I'm going to live, I'm going to have to take extreme measures. And so he pulled out a multi-tool that he had, and he started sawing his arm off. And I know that sounds a little bit gross, but he did that. He had to break the bones in his arm and then do some first aid to prevent him from bleeding out, and then make his way back to civilization. Well, this was a near fatality, and he goes around talking about this as a motivational speaker now. He wrote a book. He wrote a book about the experience and all of that. But I think this is just a prime example of how things can go bad when we're out doing something alone and we don't take proper steps. So we need to recognize the risk that some jobs are more dangerous than others. And being alone changes things. If we don't have somebody there to watch us and back us up, the possibility that we die from something that happens there goes way up. So let's think about those tasks. What could they be? As I think about the type of work that you do, members of the trust in the state of Utah, there are a bunch that are out there. Things like water main breaks. We have a line break in the middle of the night, and you're called out to go and deal with that. We've got to turn the water off. We've got to dig a hole and find the leak and get into a trench. Well, is that a hazardous duty? Absolutely. If I'm doing that alone, that is a seriously hazardous task. Working with chemicals, some process as simple as, hey, we're getting down on chlorine in our chlorinator, and so I've got to go change that cylinder out, or change a drum in in a wastewater or water treatment facility, and I do that all alone. That's a hazardous task. How about law enforcement? Well, we know that their job is hazardous, and in most cases, they're alone when they're doing that. Landscape work, working with customers, doing tasks like shutting utilities off. Well, that's hazardous to us because the customers may be hazardous to us. Things like Meals on Wheels, delivering things like that, or the counseling operations that we have around, building inspectors, you name it. There are a number of tasks that we do. Things like working at height. If I climb up on a ladder, that's a hazardous task. And if I'm alone and I take a fall, I'm at risk of potentially expiring before I can get help. But think about other things like, what about telework? I'm working out of a home office. Well, I don't have coworkers around me as well. That's probably less hazardous than some of the other things that we talk about. But what about driving? Between Mike and myself, we're pushing driving 80 to 100,000 miles per year between both of us together. Those are a lot of miles where we are alone. Okay. And what about your job? Does your job place you in doing hazardous tasks alone? Well, then the next question is, are there regulations around this that would say you can't work alone doing certain things? Are there regulations that say you've got to have a backup, you've got to have a buddy in doing this? And the answer is yes and no. There are certain specific regulations where there are some requirements, but there is not a standard in OSHA or within the United States that says lone workers have to have a system to account for them. That doesn't exist. There are a few examples like confined space entry. I have to have an attendant outside of that confined space when I'm doing that kind of work. So that's very specific to that type of work. Hazardous waste operations. If I'm going in to respond to a spill or a release of hazardous waste, I need to use the buddy system. I go in 2 at a time. And I also need to have 2 additional responders outside of that hot zone to be able to provide assistance should we have a problem in there. So it's really 4 people are required to do hazardous waste operations. In the respiratory protection standard, it talks about IDLH, or immediately dangerous to life and health concentrations. That's a concentration of a chemical in the air that would cause us to die or be overcome or not be able to exit the location. If I'm working in an IDLH atmosphere, I'm required to have somebody on the outside to be able to provide assistance to me. Power transmission has some similar requirements, and things like diving or even laboratory work. I thought that was an interesting one, that in the OSHA laboratory standard, they have a provision in there for protection of lone workers. They watched a lot of those scary movies where the scientist is working in a laboratory late at night, and they get exposed to something or they create a monster, and run into problems. And so there are a few standards that require this, but in general, if you're a public works worker or you're working in social services, there's no legal requirement that says that we have to track you, or check up with you to ensure that you're okay. Well, other parts of the world are a little bit ahead of us. The trend has really gone around the world. Countries like Australia, Canada, the European Union have regulations in place that require a system in place to track lone workers. Well, challenge with that, none of those are consistent. There's no consensus standard that says this is exactly how you have to do it. Even in Canada, it's by province. So some have really strong standards and some don't. Well, what does that mean to us? Well, it means that Jason needed to take a look at different standards and find out what would really be the best to help protect our people, because at the end of the day, we really don't care about an OSHA standard. We care about keeping people safe. And that's, in my mind, is the most important thing. And so let's talk about some things that will help us remain safe when we're out doing those jobs alone. Number one, we need to understand the nature of the hazards. There are some tasks out there that I can do alone that have really low risk of me having problems. I can still have a medical issue or something like that, or I could trip over a chair in my office. But the overall hazard is far different than going into a confined space or working in a trench or working with, as a law enforcement officer, working with somebody who doesn't mean that, or who doesn't have the best intentions for me. They might try to hurt me as an officer. Okay. We need to recognize the risk and really do that risk assessment. What is worse? What rises to the level of being a high enough hazard that we really need to check in? And then we want to take action, implement a program, and we'll talk about what those might look like. I'll just run through these quickly. Understanding the hazards. If I get in trouble, who's going to help? We should always ask ourselves that. Who knows where I am? Who knows what I'm doing? Have I been clear in explaining what task I'm doing? And sometimes we end up doing a task that's not on our checklist for the day, just because of how things change. Well, have I reported that in so I don't end up having a rock fall on my arm and being stuck there for 6 days? Um, who can I contact? And how do I contact them? Well, that seems pretty easy in a world where we have smartphones on in our pocket, and we may have a watch on our arm that we can just tell the phone verbally to call somebody. But the challenge that we run into is we live in an area where there are a lot of holes in our cellular coverage. And if we have to go up the canyon to work on the water system, or we're traveling out through a remote area, we may not have the ability to contact that person. How far away is help? How much time does it take to respond? And depending what the emergency is, it's not minutes that we need. It may be seconds to have somebody there to help out. Is our help adequate? Okay, taking action. So developing a program or a policy, and it may be a little bit of both of those, probably so. More of a program, what do we do to account for people and identify what those critical tasks are? What are those things that we have to follow our policy on. It may be okay for Mike and I to travel across the state, and when we show up in St. George or Moab or wherever we end up, sending a text out and saying, "Hey, made it fine." But in other tasks, it may be more specific and more often. And then look at our procedure. One thing that has been a standard is a checkup or check-in procedure. Checkup means periodically somebody checks up on you and says, "Are you okay?" Could be a text, could be a phone call, could be a radio call. Check in is kind of the opposite of that. The person performing the task checks in periodically and says, "I'm good. I'm here doing this task, or I've completed this task and now I'm going on to something else." And so that reduces the risk to that person, and probably how often we need to check in. And so we have to ask ourselves the question when we put this together: who is reporting to whom? That probably will involve management, supervision. That's generally the way this happens. However, there are other situations like law enforcement where we have dispatch tracking our officers. And if you've ever listened to a police scanner, you'll definitely see that, where officers are reporting in that they are back in service after doing a certain task. They will report their location, where they are, and that's a critical part of officer safety, is that simple radio call that says, "I am back in service and this is where I'm at," or I'm going to be taking a break to go get some lunch. But they're constantly calling in to dispatch to track the officers where they are, and so we can get assistance to them quickly if something goes wrong. Anybody out there recognize this picture? "I've fallen and I can't get up." Boy, I'm getting old. That goes way back there. Okay, let's keep going. So, our communication system has to work, right? It has to function, and it has to function everywhere. Because, like I said, if we go up the canyon and we don't have cell service, well, we don't have communication. So how can we handle that? What are the things that we can do that don't necessarily involve our cell phones? That's going to be the easiest way if we have coverage. But if I'm a worker that goes into those areas without service, then I need to have another option. So let's talk about what some of those may be. I just got back from a week of backpacking in the Wind Rivers, and loved it up there. One of the best parts of being in the Wind Rivers is there's no cell service. I can just set my out of office and not worry about a phone call or a text or an email. By the way, I've got a lot of emails. If you sent me one, I'm going to be digging through those, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. But as we were backpacking, we were quite a few miles in, and so if something went wrong, that could be a major problem. How would we get help if somebody took a serious fall or had a medical emergency? Well, we had some backups there. We had one of these systems here, as well as a satellite phone. One of the people that was on the backpacking trip owns a satellite phone, and he packed it along. Well, actually, he put it in my pack, and I had to pack it in. Um, he says, "Hey, can I get you to carry this in?" Um, and so we had that. He also had one of these spot systems where he was able to send out a message. So we went in, and the first night that we're there, he sends out a message. We made it fine. He had all of our emergency numbers for each of us in the group. He sent out a message that said everybody's fine, and just to make everybody at home feel okay. But we also had an option there. We could push a button that said send search and rescue or send help. And so these things are available. So there's the Spot, there's also Delorme, and a few other systems that are out there that will locate you from using a GPS and allow you to communicate back and forth. Oh, let me back up just a little bit. with cell phones. Now I know this works with Apple, with iPhones. I'm not sure if there's an analogous system in any other cell phone platform, but with iPhones they have the SOS, and you can make an emergency call in areas where, and it goes through a satellite, in areas where you may not have cell service, and so that's an option as well, but it doesn't work everywhere. There are medical alert services, satellite phones, and a variety of different things. So what works best for your organization? It depends on what type of work you're doing and where you're at. With these services, the GPS services like Delorme and the Spot service, there's a cost with that. So as we were backpacking, this guy on our trip with us sent out the text and said, "Hey, everybody's okay." But also in that text, he said, "Please don't respond to this unless there's something that needs to be said, that you need to communicate to us, because there's a cost for every text message that goes back and forth with this." So look at the system that works best for you. Okay. Mike, I don't know. I've talked a lot. Do we have any questions? Mike's
Nope,
like,
no questions.
you should give me a little bit more of a heads up before you ask me questions. Okay, no questions.
Nope,
Let,
we're good. We're good.
let's move on to the next, and probably I think one of the better options that we have, besides just calling in and check in and check up on people. It's using an electronic system. Now, this is a system that really needs to have cell service. And so that's why I talked to start with about other systems involving satellite phones and GPS locators, those types of things. These systems have to have cell service. But if I'm working in an area with service, these are great things. I am not advocating any one of these. These are some that are available. One that I really like is the one that I have pictured here. It's called Stay Safe. And that one comes out of the European Union. And I just like the functions. I will be 100% transparent on this. I have not purchased any of these programs and used them, and so I can't give a testimonial on how well they work. Only on what their applications are able to, what they promise that they're able to do. But let me just talk about this Stay Safe, and the others are very interesting as well. But this Stay Safe app has a check-in button on it. And so you can mark on there when you're doing a hazardous task. You can program it in and say, "I'm going into a confined space," and you push a button and it says, "I'm starting this hazardous task." And there's a check-in button. And so periodically you can say that, and it will have a timer on it. You can see this. It's every 10 minutes or whatever time frame you decide to do, it's going to pop up and say, "You need to check in." And it's as simple as, I'm going to push the button. That's a really handy thing. It has a panic button on it as well. You get in a bad situation, you hit the red button, and it will come up with or it will actually send out a call for 911 directly, or it will go to a specific person. If you have, some places will have a dedicated person that is receiving all of these calls, and they will try to contact the person or directly call 911 to get emergency services there. You can see in here, you can end the hazardous task. You can extend it for a certain period of time, and that allows you to pretty simply do this without having to have a phone conversation with somebody, without having to type a text message. I can simply push a button and say, "I'm okay. I'm checking in," and everything is good. From a supervisory standpoint, I don't have to be looking at things, because it's going to pop up on my phone with alert and say, "This person hasn't checked in for 17 minutes." Oh, then you can pick up and make a phone call and say, "Are you okay?" And they'll say, "Oh, sorry, I forgot to check in." That's kind of how this system will work. Or if they don't pick up the phone, well, then we're going to follow up because we can't get in contact with that person. Okay. I think these are handy. They've come a long way from the initial variations that we've seen, and I think they can be beneficial. That said, there is a cost with the systems, and so you're going to pay for the service. The applications are generally free. You can download it, but if you want it to work, you've got to pay for a subscription, just like everything we do these days is have a subscription. Okay. Um, let's just summarize what we've talked about today. There is no perfect system because everybody does things differently. And so we want to take a look at our general situation and do something. We want to say, are there situations where we have hazardous tasks that could put people in real danger when they're working alone? And if so, how do we check up on that person to verify that they're okay? How do we have them check in? And what is the system that we have to get them assistance in a reasonable time frame if something like that happens? For personally, situational awareness is so key and should be so much more important when we're working alone. Doing a job hazard analysis prior to every task and saying, these are the hazards that I'm facing, and there's an exclamation point after those hazards because I'm working alone. What do I have to do to protect myself with my safety procedures for doing that? Identify our working alone safety gap. If there's a gap in our system, that's where we need to focus. That's the attention we need to do. And if it's going to cost us some money, well, that's a cost of doing business that is pretty important. Create a policy and procedure. Use the buddy system where we possibly can. And there are some things, when in doubt, get out. I've always loved this saying. If there's something not right in the task that you're doing, or you're concerned about it, or you don't understand what you're doing, or the risks and hazards of that job, get out until we can satisfy all those questions, that we can reasonably go in and do that job with an understanding of the risks, as well as the tools that we need to help us out. All right, folks, that is the presentation today. I hope that has spurred some thought and conversation in your organizations. If you have questions or comments, please type those into the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer those right now. Mike, anything in the chat box?
Nope, don't have anything in the chat.
All right, type it quick. Any thoughts on this subject?
No, I mean, it's great. It's super important that there's just those systems in place, right? Whether it's, like you said, a check-in, a buddy system, the gaps that we have potentially there if you have one person going out. I think it's like you're saying, just a great idea to have those systems, a written policy or something in place to make sure that if you go out, you come back.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Nothing else come in for questions?
Nope, we're good.
Well, I'd love some questions, but I guess that's what we got today. Thank you, folks. I appreciate you. Appreciate all the work you do out there. I appreciate your efforts to keep yourself and your coworkers safe, and watch out for each other's backs. This is an important part of our program, whether there's a standard or a law around it or not. Let's keep our folks safe as we're out doing the important tasks that keep our state running, keep our cities and counties and districts and all of that running, and make our state a better place. So thank you so much. Go out and have a safe day.